On this episode of Race Talk with Lane and Eugene, licensed therapist and anti-racism coach Rorri Geller-Mohamed talks with us on the subject Know Better, Do Better, White People Doing Anti-Racism Work. This episode originally aired March 31st, 2021.
Good day, everyone. Welcome to Race Talk Revolution. I am Eugene Holden, your co-host, and I just want to let you know a little bit of something about Race Talk. Race Talk Revolution provides a platform for people of all races, all ages, all cultures, all lifestyles, and backgrounds to come together. We join with like-minded people who are tired of living in a country with systemic racism and strife, especially between races and cultures. Here at Race Talk Revolution, we learn how to respectfully talk about the many nuances of racism and ask questions, and we get to learn from each other's experience and then share our ideas about how each of us make a difference. And like I like to say, Race Talk is a platform where your voice matters. And now my co-host, the beautiful Reverend Lane Cobb.
Thank you, Eugene. Thank you very, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again and for being here with us. I am extremely excited about our guest speaker this afternoon. We are closing out our celebration of Women's History Month with our guest, Rorri Geller-Mohamed. And she is a social worker, a licensed social worker. She is an anti-racism coach that helps white women build their capacity to work for racial equity and justice in their lives and communities. She is the founder of the organization You Power Change and the creator of the Changemakers, a program to help white women build their anti-racism skills. She is a licensed therapist and has extensive experience working with multicultural, multiracial, and multi-faith families. She received her master's degree in social work from Columbia University and has additional family therapy training from the Ackerman Institute for the Family. Rorri's from New York City and now lives in South Florida with her husband and their two young children. And so welcome, Rorri Geller-Mohamed. Thank you so much for being here. Again, as you know, I got very excited when I learned about the work that you do with our white sisters, and I'm really looking forward to hearing you speak about how you came to that work and what your experience has been.
Thank you so much, Lane. Thank you, Lane and Eugene, for having me on today. Hi, everybody. How are you doing? I am super excited to be here. I am going to be sharing my screen. So as I'm chatting with all of you, we have a few slides before we kind of have our big conversation, right? So I'm just going to share my screen and we're going to get started. Okay. All right. So here we go. So I am excited today to talk with you about knowing better and doing better, white people doing anti-racism work. And this quote comes from Maya Angelou: when we know better, we do better. And this is related to how can we do better, right? We're here, and so we're here because we do know better in many ways. And so what can we do so that we are doing better? And I want to take a minute to talk about, tell you a little bit who I am, even though, Lane did a lot of the introduction, but I know when we're talking about issues of race, it's important to also, to really have context of some, where we're coming from for some of this. So as she mentioned, I'm a licensed clinical social worker, a therapist, anti-racism coach. I have a podcast called Racially Responsible, where we talk about how, and have guests on talking about how to build our capacity to do this work. As you can see, I'm white, and my ethnic background is actually Ashkenazi Jewish, so most of my ancestors are from Eastern Europe. My pronouns are she and her, and I actually grew up in a multiracial family in Long Island. For those of you who are familiar with the area, and if you're not, Long Island is very much racially divided, and especially when I was growing up, and maybe even not still to this day, but it still continues these racial lines and communities because of the racial discrimination around housing practices. And so that played a role in sort of how I came to this work, and I'll tell you more about that as we go on. And I'm also involved locally in this work and a lot of doing organizing and with groups that are doing this work locally. So the next thing when we talk about is, what's our call to action? When we think about doing better, what is it? What's the message that we need to be focused on? And so for those of you, if you're familiar, just put in the chat yes if you've read this book or familiar with this book, My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem. He's also a social worker and therapist, and he talks a lot about the role of trauma and how that has played a role in that racism and systemic racism and the role that trauma plays in all of this, and how what we need to do and what action looks like around healing. And so I thought this was an important quote to share today, is if America is to grow out of white body supremacy, the transformation must largely be led by white Americans. And so this is interesting, right? This concept of that, what do we need to do? Because a lot of times we're not hearing that leading. And when we say leading, we need to be very cautious and careful with what we mean by when we say leading. Because we're not leading in spaces when it's multiracial spaces and it's people of color, right? It's not saying lead in those spaces. It's saying, how are we pulling in other white Americans to be doing this work, right? What is the healing work that we need to do with other white people in the white community to challenge and end white supremacy culture and way that these systems that are set up this way, and to end racism? And so it really challenges us to look at our actions and to look at the way we're showing up and to look at the way that we are interacting with others, and to navigate that work. Because a lot of times, and not all the time, but a lot of times for white people, when we come to this work initially, we often think, oh, we're doing this for other people, right? That we're doing it, it's of course for a better world and for people of color, but really we need to recognize, what is our responsibility in this? How is this also part of our community change and transformation? So I want to tell you a little bit about how I got started doing this work, because I also want you to have the opportunity to reflect on how you came to this understanding and this work as well. So as I'm talking about this, to think about those things as well. So I just want to start with, this is my growing up. I was probably a teenager, 16, 17, around this time. That's my brother and that's my sister. One of the ways that I came to this work was I was very clear on the disparities and the way that I was being treated differently than my brother, he's a person of color. And what that meant, and especially it stood out for me in our teen years when we both kind of started driving around the same time, and he would get stopped frequently and I would never get stopped at all, right? And it doesn't mean like we were both driving fine, we both learned the same, right? Same parents that taught us, all of that, right? And we were yet treated differently. And then it went further as far as when he got stopped, that we would have to worry what would happen to him, right? Would he get arrested for no reason? Would there be some kind of, would he be mistreated for no reason? I'm trying to help you guys to see the chat. Trying to follow along with the chat as well. So that's one of the things that really started my journey into this work, and trying to say, you know what, this is messed up. This needs to change. That's one example, that there are other ways and other examples that happened where the trauma of racism really felt like he would feel it, of course, but then as family members, we would feel it. And so, how do we navigate that? How do we navigate the worry, all of that? And so that's what led me initially into social work. But the next thing that was happening was I was working as a school social worker, and I was doing a lot of therapy work with clients. And a lot of times the students and clients that I were working with were people of color, were BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color. And most of the time, the issues that were coming up were connected to racial trauma or racism in some way. And so for me, I started to think, and yes, we're doing healing work, and yes, all of that, but I wanted to take more of a proactive approach, because it wasn't enough to just be responsive. How do we end this? There's no reason that these things should be happening. What can I do to make a difference, to take a more proactive approach? And the other thing that was happening is I would get involved, I had to do lots of anti-racism trainings that I was taking and, doing my own self-study, a lot, lots of history study, all of that. And yet I'd still struggle with how to really do this work. How do I really speak up about it? I was saying something and doing things, but it wasn't enough, or it wasn't effective or impactful in the way that it needed to be. And that's why I ended up creating the Changemakers program that Lane mentioned in the beginning, was because it was an opportunity to really work on the piece of the emotions that we don't usually talk about that come up when we're having these conversations, right? What feels uncomfortable about it? We often, as white people, don't have a lot of other white people in our life that are also doing that. And so we don't have really that much support, like when we feel uncomfortable about it, to go talk to a friend about, like, how do I word this, or what should I say, what should I do? We don't always have that support as well. And so that was part of the reason that brought me to that. The next piece is, why is it so important that we build our capacity to speak up and show up for racial equity and justice? So when we think about how can we be proactive, right? It's important because we don't only want to be reactive, right? We saw when there was the horrible, the racist violence and murder of George Floyd. And then in response, we saw all the amazing, the Black Lives Matter protests and all of that happening, and all the movements that, that movement that was happening and went global. We don't want to only be reactive. That's amazing, but we also need to be proactive, right? And there's so many ways that we can do it, but a lot of times we are sometimes missing, like, the communication skills around that, or different things around that. And so I want to talk about that a little bit. I thought this was a great quote too that I wanted to share. The burden of combating racism should fall not on the shoulders of people of color, but upon white people who benefit from the privilege of living in a society that was built for them. And so this also really underscores kind of, and reminds us, like, when we think about what Reza Menachem was saying about that as well. So it's really, what is our responsibility and where do we show up in this work? And sometimes it feels really confusing. It's not always clear. It's not always easy. It's sometimes we might, we're not always sure how to do that. And sometimes we get stuck in that place of not knowing. And that often can hold us back because we're not sure what to do, or we're not sure how to say something. And it sometimes keeps us silent or stuck. And so we want to talk about how do we build these skills so that's not happening. So sometimes we are the ones doing something harmful. And that's part of the reason, right, why it's important for us to be able to build our capacity. Hang on one second, I'm supposed to drink water. Sorry. So when we think about what are things, I want to give an example of a situation where I did something harmful and had to reflect on that and work through it, because I think it's important for us to really reflect on ourselves and where we're coming from to this work. So I had gone to a networking meeting, and I had invited, that it was like 10 people in the group. It was the first time I was going to this networking meeting, but it was with an organization that I assumed it was probably mostly white people, just because of the connection with the organization that was doing it, and the community that was doing it. I have a friend that's Black who was also, we were doing something similar. And so I invited her to the networking meeting with me. And it was like a business networking meeting for something. It wasn't specifically, it was not anti-racism work. And so I invited her to the meeting, and everybody's going around, everyone gets a turn to share a little bit about their work and a little bit about what they're doing and who they are. And so everybody, we go around, and when it gets to my friend, all of a sudden, this white man starts asking her, where did she go to college? Where did she learn? Like, she had to validate her experience. She had to validate, like, her credentials for no reason. Nobody else in the group had to. And so first of all, that's messed up in itself. The other part where I messed up, where I did something harmful, was I recognized, and sometimes we don't recognize it. So part of it is, of course, having that awareness and starting to be aware and cognizant of that. But the other piece is I recognized it, but I didn't know what to say, or I didn't know how to say it, or I didn't know, like, do I interrupt? Like, he's speaking, can I interrupt? What does that mean? And so now I'm in a place where I've done a lot more of this work, and I've been practicing a lot more of this. And so looking back, I know what I could have said. I could have said, I know I know you probably didn't mean anything. It was probably unintentional, but I don't know if you recognize that the only person that you asked to validate or to explain their credentials to you was the person of color in the room. And I'm not sure if you realize that, you know, that's like a microaggression, or yeah, that's racism, or, you know, and calling it out, or just, I don't even, or just kind of leaving it open as a question. I don't know if you recognize that, and leaving it there and kind of seeing how can we create a conversation. And so part of the reason, I just want to give that example, because sometimes we're the ones doing the things. And so we need to be aware of ourselves. But then when we see it, we can also interject, and we need to build our capacity to do that. The other reason we need to build our capacity is we have access and influence to be able to make change. We have a lot more than sometimes we realize, because sometimes we feel like things have always been the way they are. And so we are either just, and we have a lot of opportunity to be able to do that. So when you think about the spaces that you're in, and this is one of the things that we do in my program, is we really think about where do you show up and who's in those spaces, right? If you notice, you know, when you go to community meetings, or when you go to your, whatever, whoever you're spending time with, when you go to certain spaces that you're, any meetings, anything like that, who's there? If you ever go to a conference, who's on the panel? And so recognizing where we are in our spaces, and the influence that we have at work, right? What influence do we have to bring up and question? You know, I want, you know, just bring it out of nowhere. I noticed who's sitting around this table. It looks like it's mostly white people. Is that intentional? How did that happen? And looking at, right, really reflecting and looking at that. And then thinking how you can use your voice to create that change. And the other part is having the responsibility to also teach the next generation. How are white children and white young people today learning to push against forms of this white supremacy around our systems of racism? How are we teaching them to build the skills to do that? And or do they have the language? Do they have the communication skills? How are we modeling that for them? And how are we teaching that? Oop, I missed one. Okay, what gets in the way of us being racial equity and justice advocates? And we talked about that a little bit. A lot of the time it's that we just don't feel equipped to have those conversations. And a lot of the time too is it's not something we were often raised talking about. A lot of times issues of race and racism were not conversations that were had in the home. And so we also haven't had that much practice growing up. And so now we're trying to like catch up. And so we're trying to hurry up and figure out how to do all of this. And so that's part of the reason, right? That we often don't feel equipped. And we also don't always have that support system that I mentioned in the beginning. We don't always have a community of people that see things the way that we do. And so understand the experiences that we're trying to, you know, and how do we shift our culture in that way? We worry about not knowing enough to engage in a conversation. Sometimes we feel like, I don't know enough how to talk about this topic. I don't know the statistics on this. I don't know how to challenge that. We worry about making a mistake. Like I mentioned before, we make mistakes and we have to repair harm. And that's the biggest part, is pushing ourselves, knowing we have to do it, make the mistake. And if we make, I mean, obviously you're not intentionally making a mistake, but we will. All of us will make mistakes because we're human. And that's part of it. And how do we repair that? So one way that I am working to repair that situation with my friend is, you know, trying to talk about it in these types of forums. I use that as an example. And so my hope is that that won't happen to anybody else. And that, of course, I know now to do better. And it was a networking meeting, and I don't know if I will ever see that person again, but if I do, I can definitely go speak to them. We avoid conversations that we think will result in conflict. And this is often from experience, because we know we have had conflict sometimes on these conversations, and we don't always know what are the right words to say, or we have to avoid the topic, or it causes arguments or disagreements, or we sometimes cut people out of our life because of that, because we struggle with that part of the conversation. And I want to just share like a little tip to help with that part, because one of the reasons that often happens is we're not connecting with them where they are. A lot of times when we find that there's that struggle of people not understanding, or like racism, structural racism, the way things are, a lot of that comes from being at different places. And so one tool to use that's helpful for this is the stages of white racial identity development. And it's created by Janet Helms, who is a psychologist. And she talks about the ways, different stages that white people go through to develop their racial identity. And so even to just reflect, to think about, when did you recognize that you were white? When did you start to notice that who your friends were? Are most of your friends similar looking or different looking than you? Was it different at different ages in your life? Was it, when did those things start happening? When did you start to recognize those things? And so if you're in a place where your awareness is more than somebody else's awareness, you're going to have to start at their level to help them push through the different stages. And so that's really important, because if not, that's when the conflict and the disagreement happens. So let's talk about how to get started building your own capacity and creating change in your life and community. The way that I move forward with this, because it's a big topic, obviously it can feel big and overwhelming. So what I use is a framework that I developed that I teach in the Changemakers course around 3 areas that we need to really focus to be change makers, to be able to be both effective in making change and impactful in making change. And so the first one is our anti-racism lens. And these are things, like I mentioned before, the spaces we're in, looking at really thinking about where we are situated in our life, who is in our life, where do we, what does that look like? What does race look like throughout our life? And the other thing, even thinking, whose land are we living on, right? Who are the indigenous people to first be on the land that we are on today? Even just recognizing like where we are physically situated is even a starting place with that. So one piece is the anti-racism lens. And it's really, how do we personalize, our growth and reflection with our anti-racism lens and use that as a tool? And a lot of times too, is we have to go back to our ancestry. When did your ancestors, qualify to be white, right? Because before there were laws in place that could have prevented even some people who are now considered white to not have the same access to it, right? So people who were Italian, people who were Irish and Jews, at one point, there was legislation that did prevent them from also having access to what other white people had at the time. And that changed over the course of time. And then we also received those privileges that were unearned and were when other people were being harmed. So it's really about having that lens, having that awareness, but digging deep into it, right? Not that surface level. The next piece is action, right? So how are we activating our family and friends? Do we feel comfortable having those conversations? I'm curious too, in the chat, if you've ever had a time where you tried to engage in this conversation and you got stuck, or it was a disagreement, or you had to disconnect from family or friends, or push people away, put yes in the chat if you've ever had that experience. Because I think that's a common one that we often can relate to, where we struggle with that. Yeah, I see that, and there's some agreement. Yep, there it is. Right, and so how do we engage people in those conversations? And especially when it's family and friends, we don't always realize that because we have that connection, we actually have more of an opportunity to make an impact for change because of the relationship. Because change happens when people can be vulnerable, and you need to have a relationship with somebody. That's why it's going to be more likely that somebody is going to have a shift in their mindset or in the way you're having this conversation than that somebody you're like arguing with on social media that you have no idea like who they are. So we need to think, how do we build our capacity to engage in these harder conversations, to do this work, to do that, which brings us to the next piece, which is resilience. And so the resilience part is, this work is very hard. It's not easy work, but yet it's necessary. And so how do we manage those feelings? It's emotional. It takes an emotional toll on us, of course, as it should. These are emotional things that are happening, right? So we need to build our resilience. And some of that is building the community of people that we know that are doing these types of things. Some of that is embracing additional compassion for ourselves. There's aspects of sort of white supremacy culture that it's failing me now. The person who, so there's white supremacy culture characteristics. And one of the things that is pointed out is this idea about perfectionism. And that many of us, because of just the way the culture is, have this idea that we have to be, it's this idea of being perfect, right? And that we can't make mistakes. And so it takes away aspects of our humanity if we hold it up to this standard. And that's part of us building that resilience of recognizing what role are these characteristics actually playing in our life that we don't recognize, that it's so ingrained in us, we're not even always aware of it. And then once we are, now how do we challenge it so we don't feel like we have to live up to those standards, and that our institutions aren't also upholding those same expectations and characteristics. So that's a big piece of the resilience piece, is building up our emotional capacity and knowing that how do we navigate doing this work? Sometimes it's going to be harder. Sometimes it's going to be, we're going to need more support, and practicing it, right? That over time, it's also a muscle that we continue to build and we continue to strengthen. And so your resilience also over time, as you continue to practice this, will also build that resilience. So I want to leave you with this quote before we open the conversation. And this is by Angela Davis. I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I'm changing the things I cannot accept. A lot of times we've heard the quote, just to accept the things we can't change. But we don't want to do that. We want to challenge the things that we cannot accept because it's not okay. And we need to believe that we have a capacity to actually make change, because we do. So I want to thank you all for listening to this. I know we have lots of discussion going on. I actually see one in the chat too. I'm going to stop my screen so we can jump in and any questions and all of that.
Well, may I just ask a question before we get going? First of all, thank you, because what a wealth of information. You're talking so fast. I'm like, okay, I'm going to write all this down.
It's the New Yorker in me.
No, it's okay. I'm not complaining, because there was so much in there that you wanted to get out. I think it's fabulous. I'm not complaining. I speak fast too. I don't know if you noticed. So my question is this. I agree. I love the quotes that you used about the onus of eradicating racism being on our white brothers and sisters. And I believe that without white allies, our voices as people of color would not be resonating now, if ever. It would be, so now I do believe that that is critical, and clearly you do too. My question is, with the work that you do, how easy or difficult is it for you to bring people into this conversation, to have white people come into your programs and actually want to have this conversation? And of course, it's specifically white women.
Right. So the people that mostly come into my program are ones who already have some awareness and are struggling with things, often in families. So like wanting to do more and not sure how. And so it's not hard to get to people in that part who already have the desire to want to be part of making change and want to build these skills. So those people, that part is not hard to get. Those people are interested, and those are the people that are mostly participating. The ones who really don't see it are not the ones coming in right now to the program, but are the ones that individually and collectively, right, that we're having conversations with. The group is working on how do we, now that we're learning these skills, go and have the conversations with those people that don't get it yet, to push them along that spectrum so that then they get it and then they come in to do that. So I do, the thing is, it's like, yeah, it does, even personally, right, when I've had those conversations with white people that don't get it, that I know in my life, it's hard, and it's, of course, it's painful because it's people you know, right? It's people that you care about, it's people that you love. And so when you're thinking about how to have that conversation, it's also that if you avoid the conversation, or if you aren't able to sometimes work through it, because it's not also one conversation. It's always has to be multiple conversations. It's not going to be one conversation and changing. But it's going to be these multiple conversations. But without doing that, the relationship is also harmed. there's disconnection in the relationship. So you have to make a choice. Like, and I don't even necessarily think it's really a choice, because I think to not sometimes choose to do the work because it's hard, shouldn't be an option either. But I do think it doesn't mean that it's not hard, and it doesn't mean that there's not always ways to see it. I think to believe that it is possible, because it is, and because, you know, we've seen it and that has happened. But it does take time, and it takes time for people to get into a vulnerable place. And that's why that's why I teach a lot of things coming from a therapeutic background, because the same changes that often transition people in the therapy room, where we are able to create that safe space, where we're able to go to those places that are really hard, and even make connections around trauma, right? People's own trauma and what that looks like. So I would say it's people who already have an awareness, it's easy, are definitely coming in. It's the people who are not yet aware or don't understand it that we are working on to still pull in. And that is hard.
Thank you so much for answering that question. I'm going to turn this over to Eugene now.
Great, great, great. Rorri, thank you so very much. Lots of really good information. And so I just want to open this up now to the Q&A. There are a lot of good questions in the chat. And if those who have written some questions in the chat, if you feel, you know, moved to ask your questions, you know, on camera, that would be great, or at least on the mic, that would be great. Now, remember that you, in terms of your question and or comment, you have about a minute or so, because you want to give everybody time to say what they want to say here. And so we're going to start our Q&A with Roy. Welcome, Roy. And you, right now you're on mute, Roy. You want to unmute yourself.
Okay, did you say Rorri or Roy Chavez? That's what I asked.
Roy Chavez.
Okay, I'm Native American, and I grew up with, I was raised by white parents. And I remember my dad saying to me, my white dad saying to me, that people can only be prejudiced against you if you allow them to be prejudiced, and if you allow them that prejudice to affect you. And so I try to always think about that when in my job or whatever I'm trying to do. If people are prejudiced against me, I always try to think, well, that's not my problem, it's your problem. And that type of an attitude, and a lot of times I did not realize, and when you spoke, Rorri, about awareness, that I was not aware that people were prejudiced against me until later on, and until I realized that there was prejudice involved, and that I didn't have a chance to stand up and say something. And had I been able to do that, maybe I would have been able to affect some type of change. And well, it's been only been later in my life, when I'm older, that I've been able to speak up against prejudice, because I'm able to see it later on. So an awareness is, I guess, is where I'm, there's a lot of things that you covered, so I try to focus in on one thing at a time. So how should I have been able to be aware of prejudice, and should that have affected me, or should I have just ignored it like my father told me?
Thank you, Roy.
I mean, so I think that's really interesting, because I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's both and, right? Because if you're experiencing, you know, you have to do what makes sense for you, right? As somebody who comes from an Indigenous background, right? As a Native American background, that your father, he was saying, you know, and the other part of prejudice, right? So individuals are prejudiced, but we're existing with systems of oppression. And so to not say it, you have to, how could you know, make the decision of, is this somebody I'm choosing to engage in conversation with? Do I have the emotional energy and emotional capacity to do that? as somebody who is experiencing on the side of the prejudice side, you have to really make the choice, right, for yourself. What do you feel like is most healing and feels best for you in the moment? Where I feel like a white person who is not where the prejudice is not being directly pushed on, could be used and may have extra emotional energy that could speak up in that space. So I know it's not really a direct answer to it. I mean, I think, yes, there can be conversations where that shifting can happen. And I think it depends on what the relationship was with the people who were saying those things, if it was a workspace, what it was. But I think the other part, just from working with people with racial trauma as a therapist, like on the other side, right, with BIPOC, that have experienced that, I mean, part of that is also your healing, the healing journey that goes along with that, right? And how your racial identity and your background, like, even though you grew up, you know, with a white father and a white family, that it's still, your experience is different than theirs. And so the way he could respond to things might be different than the way you can and should respond, or, you know, want to respond to things. I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, one of the ways that I realized that I was prejudiced against, and later on, if I said anything about it, was that when I found out who was hired in place of me, and when I had the qualifications in my resume and a degree and all that stuff, and found out that somebody else that didn't have any of that was hired, and I did not say anything about it. It's because I just ignored it.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Roy. Ooh, we have Lynn. Good morning, Lynn.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you so much for your presentation, Rorri. It was very powerful. I wanted to make a statement about, or a question also, about the same slide that Reverend Lane referenced. And I'm really challenged to let my freedom, or leave my freedom, or the fight for my freedom in the hands of people that aren't directly impacted by it, or who also benefit highly from me not being free. So in that vein, I mean, I believe in allyship, and I think it's necessary. I think that also somewhere a statement needs to be made about the importance of people of color continuing to fight and to be in the forefront of the fight. I've heard that what your slide said, I've heard that a lot. And it feels to me like it's leaving our struggle or our fight or our quest for greater rights to the hands of white people. And so I'm just throwing that out. If you'd like to make a comment.
No, I appreciate you saying that. Thank you. And I think that's correct, right? Like, I mean, of course, like, I agree with you. I don't think, it shouldn't be white people leading that fight, right? For those rights, but white people should be working to shift the culture. What I'm saying is, like, within, you know, with our family, like in our family culture, in our community culture, where there's still so many like white communities, right? That those conversations aren't happening. And so how are white people shifting those conversations, and how can they be leading in those spaces where it's to do that? And amplifying voices, right? You know, of people of color, like you're saying, that are directly impacted. So I totally agree with you. And I think if I ever do this part again, I will add something in specifically to speak to that point as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What I have on here is Michael Carmen, and then Tyrone, you're after her.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Rorri. This is so helpful. So my question is this: I've been trying to learn how to do things better, and making mistakes. That's a whole separate issue. If we have time, I'll ask you about a mistake I made. But this is something different. I'm a college teacher. I teach writing. And for many years, I've had writings by people of color and all kinds of heritages to give to my class. I have a very disparate, usually diverse class, which is great. Last semester, for the first time, I included writings on white privilege by both white people and Black people, and then other writings by James Baldwin and others. And I was a little nervous about that, but I had a very varied class. So the way I approached it, and it worked out okay, was for the white privilege pieces. I said to the students, please write a short one-page essay on your experience of white privilege. Sort of had my heart in my mouth. And they did a wonderful job, and they had great discussions. And people who had white skin said, oops, I've made mistakes sometimes. Or sometimes they said, I don't do that, but other people do. And some people who had other colors of skin said, boy, I have this experience. So I thought that was great. This semester, it just so happens that I have only maybe 1 or 2 people who have white skin, and I can't always be sure where anybody's coming from. So I thought maybe I should withhold this reading business. And I thought, okay, I'm not going to send those particular articles because that would be pointing at people who are experiencing the brunt of that, and asking them to talk about their pain maybe. And then about 2 weeks ago, I got a note from a former student who said, I'm applying for this scholarship. Would you please, whatever. She's a great student of mine from the past. She said, by the way, I want you to know, and she's a student of color, a Black student, wonderful student. And she said, I kept the essay I wrote on white privilege. And she's a real, bold person. And I've been copying it and showing it to my white friends and educating them. and they're getting a lot out of it. So I thought, oh, maybe I should go ahead and do it anyway. So I took a chance and I sent these white privilege essays by mostly Black people and then white people to my students. So I've already done it, but I just want to know what you think of that. I think as a teacher, I'm obligated, I want to show my students what's going on. And I always say, I don't know the answers to these questions. I always start that because I'm no expert. I never say I'm anti-racist because I don't know. But what do you think of that approach? And do you think that that sort of thing should be, that I should, as a teacher, should be watching out for the kinds of things I give to people based on their color?
I think, first of all, it's great that you're kind of being reflective about it. I think that's a great place to start about kind of what are, and what was the responses. I would say, because it's not just specifically, right, like this one thing, it's kind of like, what does that look like for the class across the board, right? For all the whole semester, how does it fit with all of the pieces? So what I would be curious, when you think about what are these conversations looking like with colleagues, right? With colleagues of color that are doing this work also, how are they maybe addressing this in their class also? And so I would make it more and also, when you're kind of talking about those things, would it make sense to maybe have somebody co-facilitate that kind of discussion with you to make sure that there's pieces that maybe aren't being missed, having a person of color co-facilitate some of those, that part of it? Because I think that helps, as we're learning and growing. And I don't know that there's like a right or completely wrong, right? I think it's the way that it is done and the way that the conversation and how people are feeling, right? Some students may feel one way and some students may feel another way, but how do you make space so that, and maybe in preface with giving the class the opportunity to say, like, is this something that they think is something that how does that feel for them, right? Is to learn. Does it feel like it's something that could be like harmful? You don't want it to be. And if not, here's another option or something like that. So that's kind of the way that I would go about it. I would just kind of dig deeper and look at it. It's not just this one part of having this discussion, but what that looks like in the way that those things are happening across the board.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Thank you very much. We have Tyrone and then Amber or Ambry. I'm going to ask you how to pronounce your name correctly. Tyrone.
Hi, Rorri. Love your energy. Beautiful energy. Here's some concerns I have. Okay. There are so many communities in our country that are all white. Maybe a little drop of chocolate and some white milk, but bottom line, not a lot, right? So the concept of white people looking at themselves as white, often they just see themselves as human. So human gets defined as white in their world, right? And then everybody else is other, who may be talking about race so much they're racializing every conversation, or racialize. I'm not sure if I'm using the word correctly, but every conversation. Why you guys always bring up race? How come you just can't be human? I've heard that so many times. So if you have a concept of human as being white, okay, where's the starting point to try to break through that? That's one. The other thing is that, considering that especially close to half of the country who voted for Trump, I'm bringing the political element in, right, who get upset when you even bring up the term of being racist. In fact, turn a deaf ear to it. So how do you speak to those folks who immediately label you as a radical liberal who's talking out the side of your neck, about racial issues? Those are real concerns. And then that impacts the real change, to me, that has to happen economically, that has to happen politically, the power structure within that group. I understand you're going down to the basic elements and trying to break it up and go from there. I get that. But how do you deal with that concurrently? Because that's a real concern.
Thank you, Tyrone.
Yeah, that's great questions for sure. And that's when I was talking about the white racial identity development model that I think, and if you just Google it, you could kind of, there's different, you can sort of see it. I think it's important to see, where they're at with that. And so I do think a lot of it is education, right? And so how do they learn? Yes, they see themselves as human because they've never had to be challenged to see themselves as anything other than that, that everybody else is put into these categories and they never had to be put into a category. And so how do we change that conversation? How do we change that? And so when we talk about kind of meeting people where they're at and not where we are, it's sort of identifying where are they within that identity development model. And if part of that is it might be having the conversation, well, who is in their life? If they're mostly, you're saying, no, if it's mostly white communities, if most of their people that are in their life are white, they really don't have the experience of knowing people that are anything other. And so they don't know the personal experiences. They don't have a human connection necessarily of what that is with other people. And so I think there's multiple aspects. I think one aspect is starting to increase their, being around others, right? Like what do they need to know? They need to know history. How do we teach history? History, of course, in this country is not taught accurately. And so that's a big piece. As we teach history more accurately and with emotion, kids will hopefully younger generations will start to grow up with that idea and understand what racial, what race is and what that looked like throughout history. So I think I started the starting point. That's what I think. But when you talk, I hear you say like the systems. And that's when I say like our sphere of influence, because systems are also made up of people. So if we have a white person that's a CEO who doesn't get it and their sister understands it and gets it and is doing something, if the sister can have the conversation with that person that could turn on a couple light bulbs and maybe make a couple shifts, that's where that can happen. But too often what happens is we cut off those people because it hurts, and because it's harmful, and because it feels painful. And we say, we don't want to have those conversations. They don't understand. I'm putting that they're in this category. And if we never do, that's the work that's hard, that unfortunately we have to do because it hasn't been done. And so I feel as white people, that's a big call to action with white people. How do we not just call out and say, this is messed up, what you're doing is really screwed up, that's really harmful, what you're saying, what you're doing, but also give them the opportunity to call them into this work for change. So for example, if it's somebody you have a relationship with, you can identify other qualities that they have that are positive. I know that you are a kind and caring person, or you're really great at this, or you always do whatever it is that you're always looking out for me or for other people in our community. And so it seems really strange to me that this other piece is off, because it feels like your values aren't exactly matching your actions, or what you're saying doesn't exactly match what you want. And so I think it's both. It's pushing against the systems, and I think it is still doing that activism, that organizing, and showing up in the political realms. But the other part of that piece that I see is that takes slower and that takes longer is, and even what Resmaa Menakem talks about in his book is so much of it is based on history of trauma. And even like white people seeing those trauma, like witnessing the trauma. And so like how much of it is like this automatic thing that he identifies. What does healing have to look like so that white people, part of our identity is pushing against these systems, that it's part of our culture? How do we shift the way we show up to do that. And so there's not like an easy 1, 2, 3 answer, like, oh, do this. But that's why I think it's both in the conversations, the way we navigate those conversations, and making sure we don't check out of them. Sorry.
How are you? Okay.
And just making sure we're not checking them on the phone.
I hear what you're saying, and I guess we'll just save it for another conversation later. I know where your heart is, and that part I really appreciate a lot.
Thank
right?
you.
But when people are in silos and all they're doing is listening to, Fox or whatever world they're listening to, and others listening to that, and culture, cancel culture, and all these terms are being thrown out to cover over people not willing to look at stuff within themselves.
Right. So that's where the family therapy piece, that's where I would apply sort of family and relational therapy, because those people who are in those silos, is there anybody in that network? Usually there is. Usually there's one person, some that they're connected to in their community somewhere that sees something a different way. And so that person has to commit to doing that work. And I'm not saying they can't do the work on everybody at the same time. That's what the resilience is, that resilience piece, so that we can't just give up, right? And because it's hard, it is, I'm not saying, and that's such a big piece of the work, because it's frustrating. It's very frustrating, and it's emotional, and it's tiring, and it's painful. But it's who is connected to that network of people in those silos that can start those conversations. And like I have, for example, so I have someone, one of my clients who started like a book club with her family. And so it doesn't have to be straight into those the books specifically on anti-racism. It could be a book about history, it could be a book about something, but you're creating an opportunity to open up conversation where people can start to be vulnerable and talk about those issues. So if we can't even we need to be able to have the dialogue. The other person has to not go into defense mode, because if they're in defense mode, the dialogue isn't happening. So we have to somehow pull out the compassion, push ourselves into a really hard place where it sucks to be in sometimes, right? Because we know that doing this, and the more that if we keep going, we're gonna see that shift, and we're gonna see that change, because that's what we see, right? That's what we see with connections, and that's how that works. So
great. Okay, we have the initials FF, then we have John, and then we'll close out the Q&A with Adine.
Hi, thanks for letting me, and thanks for the presentation. I think you really nailed it when you said this work is hard, it's heavy, it sucks. I'm more out this week, and I'm not even in Minneapolis. I'm not connected to the trial, except just emotionally what's happening and what has happened. But I'm really happy to know that there's a responsibility that we all carry, and that privilege is a responsibility that holds you to fixing the problem. So I really resonate with, it's also a white person's problem to fix. And it's not just a burden on me or even my race, or as when I show up as a person of color or African-American, I've got to fix it all. My question to you is, after plugging into so many conversations around privilege and allies, which I think is very important, and I understand the possibility of those in power who can make these types of changes, what's the platform? I think this week I've gotten a little overwhelmed with just learning. I've been learning, and it's been great because it's been these conversations of Black and whites and Latinx and Native Americans all talking about these issues, and I really like it. But this week, with everything going on, the Derek Chauvin trial, I've been like wanting action, solution. And I've been feeling like, how long is the conversation gonna keep going? And that's okay if we're talking and if that's a part of the solution. But my question is to you, who's a professional in this space, what's the plan of action from all of the dialogue on anti-racism? I'm also reading Resma's book right now in a book club. That's a mixed group. So I'm plugged in like 4 or 5 different ways with mixed conversations. I just want to understand the solution behind this whole anti-racism conversation. I also studied the book last year with a mixed race of 6 weeks. Again, so I respect the work and that conversation and people becoming aware of what they seem like they don't know. But I want to know, what's the action? We've got pressing issues going on right now this week. And many of us are on pins and needles, right? But it can be something tomorrow. Last week it was Asian hate. Like, there seems to be an opportunity, and I just am asking, what is the action beyond just the dialogue? Thank you.
I think that's a great question. And right, you're saying, right? It's it's emotional, it's heavy, it's hard, and it's frustrating because action, it should have, we shouldn't be doing this right now, right? This should be done. There's no reason that we should still be living how we're living and that these things are still happening. And so I think it's sort of the twofold of organizing is a big piece of this. And so how are we connected locally? I think a big piece is locally change. How do we locally work in community organizing? And so that's a big piece that we teach too, of how are we involved with community organizing? And that's like putting political pressure, doing things, you know, economically, like what does that look like? But I think so much of that is also like with our local elected officials, and how often do we not even know who those people are sometimes running, right? So like part of it is making sure that we know locally what is happening, and are we connected to, most of the time there's already groups doing community organizing in our communities that we can plug into that are taking action, whether it's working on legislation, whether they're protesting, you know, whatever it is, protesting legislation. How are we, and it is, I think it's speaking up to legislators, speaking up, stepping in, you know, reaching out to the police to make sure, what are they doing, right? What does police reform look like in your local community? Like, yes, national, and I think national is important, but when we're saying like, it can feel big and overwhelming. So if we're looking for like, where do we start? My answer for that specifically would be like, it starts locally. And I mean, in the schools, right? Is there a equity committee in the schools? What are they doing? How are the policies being changed? Even something as simple, right? Like for me, I mean, I'm very big like on education, because I feel like, you know, how is the next generation learning to not repeat what's happening right now, and how are they ending it? So like curriculum wise, are kids being taught accurate curriculum? Are they being taught skills to push against this? Like to me, when you're getting it, kids should be taught anti-racism education, like that in schools, that should be a main piece of education. And so it might be advocating for that in your local school. And if you live in a very white community and most of the kids in your school are white, you still need to push for that. You still need to make sure that those kids are learning that, and that political education is happening. Are you showing up locally? Like, are there, whether it's marches, whether it's, I mean, elections, I think is a big thing. Are we showing up for that? Are you financially supporting that? Right? Are you, sometimes we may be able to financially support those local groups if we're not able to always physically show up for stuff. That's a big piece too. So I think a part of that, like a big piece is, it's the frustrating piece of, you know, this should have happened already. And so how do we do that action and do that piece? And then to make sure too, like, you know, you're sitting, you know, and it's heavy, it's hard. So what does your own healing need to look like? How are you finding your own, like, what do you need for your own joy right now to deal with like everything going on? Like for you as like, yes, community wise, can your community create like a healing space for right now to manage the emotional effects that are happening because of the trial, right? What are the conversations, like what would healing look like? And I think that's part of the conversation. What does that need to be? So I think it's both the action and the other piece.
Thank you so very much. We have John, and then we have a Dean. John, you're on mute.
Okay. All right.
And just real fast before you start, John, we only have just a very short amount of time, so let's keep this as short as possible, okay?
I'm going to be very brief. Going back to your, Rorri, your initial introduction, you mentioned the encounter that you had with a person that was exhibiting bias in the networking meeting. So my question is had you had the opportunity to bring to her attention, or that person's attention, that they were acting in a biased manner and may not even have been aware of it? If they acknowledge, yeah, you're right, you know, I didn't realize it, what's the next conversation beyond that acknowledgement with that person?
I think that's a great question. So the acknowledgement, like, so if they acknowledge, yes, I didn't realize that. And I think most of the time they wouldn't have, right? It wasn't out of malice. You could tell it was not unintended. It was not to be harmful. I completely don't think it was.
Right.
So I think it's how do I then engage them and maybe say, you know, let's connect, let's stay connected so we can continue talking like about this conversation, or continue saying, well, you know, are there other ways that maybe this is showing up, or maybe you'd be interested in joining one of our, you know, like an organizing group locally, getting more information of what else is their understanding around these issues? Because I think a big piece is, if they are where they are now, how am I helping them to get to a more anti-racism place, which is being actively anti-racist? And what does that look like? So I think it's just, it could be continuing that relationship, and that's based on the resilience of my emotional capacity. If my emotional capacity is spent on this other organizing piece or something like that. I may not choose to continue it, but it could be in that space, right? What is the networking meeting doing and that organization institutionally to ensure that those types of things don't happen? Because how do we ensure that doesn't happen again? So maybe something is said ahead of time, right? Maybe some kind of comment is made before the meeting starts. We know we want to always be intentional about whatever it is, right? Maybe an education piece is put in, because those are types of things that are common. So we want to look at how did that group come together? What's the history of that group? What other types of things might be going on? So I think it's like an institutional aspect as well.
Thank you so very much. Thank you, John. We have Adine. Karen, I do see your hand up, but we don't have time where we're over time now. But thank you so very much. Adine, go ahead.
Rorri, thank you very, very much for an excellent, excellent presentation. I'll try to make this brief. I have 2 points. The first one I wanted to address to our first commenter, Roy Chavez. I think, Roy, what you were sharing with us was a generational piece. Your father's advice to you, just sort of keep your head down and not speak up your pain. We see this even now in the African American community as the younger people are getting louder and stronger and angrier. The older people have long memories. We know how viciously and violently the white community can fight back and hurt us. We're perfectly aware of it. We know that the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th would love to get their hands on a Black community. They'd love it. We're sort of assuming that all whites want to, with the right training, do the right thing. And I say that's absolutely wrong. There are a lot of them who are perfectly happy with the problems they are causing and want to continue causing these problems. As for education, I'm a retired educator and I'm on a couple of DEI committees. That's diversity, equity, and inclusion committees. They're wonderful. The work that we're starting to do is very interesting and very good. But at the same time, conservative groups are fighting back with all their strength to make sure that this information does not come to the fore.
Thank you. Thank you, Adine.
So Eugene, if it's okay, yes, Rorri, please make some last comments and then we'll close out for the day.
Yeah, so I know if anybody has, thank you everybody so much. This was a wonderful conversation. If anybody has any more questions, please feel free to email me. I'm here. I'm happy to, if you're stuck and things come up, right, in the future, if you're somewhere a meeting and you just want extra insight, please reach out. I'm very passionate, as you can tell. So my info's in there. Feel free to reach out with anything.
All righty, man, this has been a wonderful, wonderful time. We are over time. Jerome, we don't have time for the question. Again, this is Race Talk Revolution, where your voice matters, especially when your voice matters. Thank you again so very much. Lane?
Just thank you, everyone. Thank you for staying for this wonderful conversation. Rorri Geller-Mohamed. We will certainly be in touch again. Please continue to come and we can have you back. People have obviously resonated with this message and you have a wealth of more information to share with us. Folks, please continue to show up. We are so grateful for your community and we have another great speaker coming to you next week. And I don't have time to tell you who it is, so you just have to show up to find out. Have a great week, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.